How's it going? Can everybody hear me good? All right, good. All right. Kyle, how's it going?
Doing great. About yourself?
Pretty good. This is not alcohol. This is water, by the way, you guys. It's just a cool bottle. It's a cool looking bottle.
It doesn't look like a flask.
It does look just like a flask. My other students always laugh about it. It's like, where's your flask at? Um, Maya, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
Pretty good.
Good.
Yeah. Megan, how's it going?
I'm good. Sorry, I'm just eating. I just got off work, but I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Anine, how are you?
Doing well. How are you?
How about you, Charles? How are you? How's it going?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. Jasmine, you enjoying this lovely weather here in Chicago?
Of course I am. I did not wear a jacket today, so I was happy. Okay, how about you?
Yeah, me neither. Yeah, same here. I just wore a blazer and I was fine with just that. Chloe, how are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you.
All right, good to see you. Madison, how's it going?
It's good. I'm a little tired. There's a whole bunch of construction going on in my house. So it starts really early in the morning and I'm not really a morning person. So they've been doing demo for the past like 3 days. And it's like, I didn't realize taking out drywall and all this stuff. Like every time I look in the room, there's more things revealed behind another layer of whatever they used to build houses. I'm like, this is crazy.
It's like it never stops.
Yeah, and they can just move electrical wherever. It's kind of cool to like see it all come apart, but I'm really hoping it comes back together soon.
Yeah, sounds like it. Do you try to sleep with like some headphones on and put on some white noise or something?
I'm a pretty solid sleeper, so usually I can sleep through it, but I'm actually sort of coordinating the project, so I have to be awake to kind of chat with everybody before they come in. So it's like 7:30 when my usual wake up is a little later than that.
Yeah, sounds hectic. You know what I listen to now to help me go to sleep is brown noise. Anyone ever heard of brown noise? Yeah, it works.
I've tried, and I don't know how you do it. That's all I can say. It's so distracting.
Oh, you don't like it?
I do like it. No, I tried, and I had a previous partner who used it, and I was like, this is so annoying. Like, How could you sleep?
Oh,
So
wow.
hats off to you.
Yeah.
It doesn't help me. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know what, I like the brown noise. It's a little bit more smoother than like white noise. Whereas white noise, it sounds like plain static in the background, sometimes kind of harsh. The brown noise I like. Anybody else use brown noise to help them sleep, or white noise for that matter? What do you use, Maya? Which one?
I used to always use white noise or just like have my fan on full blast, like even in the winter, because I like the sound of it. But brown noise has literally saved me. I love it.
Yeah, like since I like discovered it, and there's like some really good ones on YouTube, like I don't think I could go back. What about you, Megan? Which one are you using?
I use brown noise because my boyfriend snores. And so I put brown noise on my phone and then I put my phone right on his face. And it works.
And he doesn't wake up at all?
No,
Wow.
no, he's a solid sleeper. So I just put it on high, like right next to his face. He's good to go.
Wow, that's amazing. Who else? Who else said they were using it? Who else used white noise or brown noise?
You know, I'm team lo-fi. I use lo-fi sleep. I don't know if anyone's ever used lo-fi to sleep. It's a little bit, it's a different vibe, but yeah.
Lo-fi? What is that like, Jasmine?
It's, if I could describe it, it sounds like if you like smooth jazz, but just way
Yeah.
slower, like just a lower vibration of that. Yeah, so try it out.
I gotta try that out.
Yeah.
I love smooth jazz. Yeah, I love smooth jazz. So something slower would be interesting to see. All right. Okay, it looks like we got a couple presentations, or maybe one of them. Who said that they were ready to present? Okay, so Maya. Was anyone else? Okay, so just Maya, your group? Okay, so who's all in your group?
It's me, Haneen, and Chloe.
Okay, Maya, Haneen, and Chloe. And then last week we had Kashay, Nicholas, and Megan, right? That was your group? Was there anybody else that presented last week besides that group, or no? Okay, that was it. Okay, cool. All right, Maya, Haneen, Chloe. Yeah, have at it. Let's see what you got.
Right. All right. Can everyone see the screen? Good.
Yes.
All right. So our presentation today is going to be about cultural mental health stigmas and treatment-seeking behavior among South Asians. So the reason why we chose this topic, just kind of after a brief literature search, so a 2020 study found that there are higher levels of mental health stigma, particularly for depression in the East as compared to the West. And then a 2014 study found that cultures with greater mental health stigma have less individuals who get diagnosed and actually seek treatment. So given these study findings, we wanted to look at kind of the cultural factors and stigma surrounding mental health and how they affect diagnosis and treatment-seeking behavior, specifically of people with psychosis and mood disorders. So psychosis kind of more like schizophrenia, and then mood disorders, mostly like depression and anxiety, specifically among South Asians. So for the purposes of our presentation, South Asia is defined in the literature as the region comprising of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan, and in certain contexts, Afghanistan, Burma, the Maldives, and Tibet. So just a brief literature summary. So social cultural stigma regarding mental health not only is a factor in decreasing treatment-seeking behavior in Indian culture, but it also limits access and the availability of mental health care. And another study showed that among South Asian university students, there is both perceived and personal stigma regarding mental health. And additionally, higher levels of stigma were associated with negative attitudes towards seeking psychological help. So traditional Asian culture values emotional restraint and self-control, which causes discomfort with the disclosure of mental health status outside of the family, which then in turn affects treatment-seeking attitudes and behaviors. So kind of a theory that we came across in the literature was the theory of reasoned action. And so the results of a 2016 study proved that there in fact is a relationship between cultural stigma and decreased treatment-seeking behavior. So this diagram just kind of shows how culture feeds into beliefs, which in turn affect your intentions for treatment seeking, and then therefore that reflects and impacts the following behaviors that you partake in following that. So it's kind of just a vicious cycle.
So to continue on with the literature summary, we found that among South Asian and Caucasian college students, South Asians have a more stigmatized view of depression compared to Caucasians, especially when the person is of South Asian descent. We also found that among South Asians residing in America, symptom presentation varies by generation. So stigma and denial of mental illness were defined as a major barrier to treatment. And it should also be noted that caution should be exercised when examining the literature on the mental health of South Asian women, as they are often constructed in stereotypical ways. Bird 2002 argues that mental health professionals view South Asian women as passive or immobile, which results in their cultures being considered as inferior. And now to talk about some of the mental health barriers among South Asians is the avoidance of shame can lead to a reluctance of South Asian women to access mental health services. Negative mental health may bring shame and pose threats to family honor. Therefore, we consider it a barrier to seeking treatment. We also found that 75% of individuals with serious anxiety, mood, impulse control, or substance abuse disorders in low and middle income countries received no care, and mental health care and research is a low priority area. We also found that higher rates of common mental health disorders are associated with less privileged social standing and lower levels of education and material disadvantage, or factors associated with poverty, such as poor living conditions.
All right, so now moving on to our group reflections. So as we know, as future mental health professionals, culture is going to be a really important consideration in the diagnosis and treatment of all of our clients, and implications specifically for the South Asian population. We know that stigma is inhibiting access to basic mental health information and care. And in a lot of cases, this is despite knowledge that mental illness is treatable, and that, you know, this is an area that there's just pretty much like a lack of like awareness around like psychoeducation and engaging the community. And so we have looked at some practical implications, and basically finding that we, you know, in this population, we need to be utilizing greater knowledge sharing and community engagement. And there's just not a lot of literature regarding effective interventions for this population yet. So moving on to the next slide. We were looking at like what else can South Asians do to promote mental health, since there isn't a lot of literature specifically on interventions that work within this population. So like what else can we do? First would be culturally appropriate psychoeducation for South Asians. So taking into account, like the stigmas that exist, and then modifying psychoeducation for this population in that way. Also community-based intervention and engagement to promote mental health. And a lot of the research showed that strong personal support systems like friends, families, community groups, that really helps, as well as raising awareness around help-seeking behavior and just doing what we can to promote destigmatization within this population. So then moving along. We have our references, and then we wanted to open up the floor to a Q&A. So we have some questions listed out here if anybody needs a starting point. But yeah, I'll let you guys all take a second to read that and then let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, go ahead. Anybody who has questions, whether they're on the board or just in general. Actually, I find the second one interesting. I'd like to know kind of what you've assessed from that, like what aspects of South Asian culture and religion increase symptoms of depression and anxiety? What did you find or sort of gauge from your research?
I can answer this one. I had read an article listed in the references that said that the younger generation who are more influenced by the Western society with, social media platforms and things like that are kind of separating themselves from traditional religion and cultural values. And so I found that the impact and the push for older generations to keep, the culture and traditions in place causes a lot of feelings of, for lack of a better word, like they feel pressured to keep on, even if it's not their own beliefs, if they're atheist or anything. And so I feel like that can cause a lot of anxiety in doing between what their parents or their grandparents want them to do and practice versus what they want to do, and the influential factors of social media and stuff like that.
Excellent. Yeah. What did you discover anything in terms of, say, like that younger generation that you're talking about, like ways that they're going about sort of helping alleviate some of that stress or anxiety, like because of the disparity between older and the younger generations? Some of the things that they're practicing?
I read some of the in some of the research that younger generations are more open to help seeking behavior, and so that was defined as like reaching out within community or social groups. In some cases, like I guess that would like also mean like family and friends, but yeah, like the younger generations are more open to this idea. And I would also assume that like that leads into just like greater knowledge sharing and like greater psychoeducation. Like if you're, I don't know, just like if you're more comfortable in your social group to like speak about like personal struggles, that's obviously gonna like, lead to greater outcomes in mental health. And then maybe the older generations are just more closed off in that regard.
Gotcha. So you think that could lead to the young generation of just seeking out sort of therapy in general, as opposed to maybe the older generation?
Maybe. And like, I mean, a lot of it talked about like media access too, and just like, just like being more open to these ideas.
Yeah.
just being more open-minded, I think, which is, I think, actually the case among like generational differences as a whole, not just like within South Asians, but that was identified in the literature.
Yeah, definitely. So it's a shift in a mindset, right? Of being at least having possibility, thinking differently, seeing things from a different point of view, a different worldview, possibly. Anyone else got any questions?
When you was doing your studies, did you find that mental health services were a cultural reject or just an unknowledgeable reject?
I feel like there was a lot of a cultural reject just because in the literature it did say that seeking help or admitting that something is wrong causes a lot of shame onto the family. And they talked about how it can kind of ruin the honor of the family. And so I feel like it was a lot of keep everything hush hush or, you know, don't disclose anything is my understanding of it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
In which case you figure that could lead to a lot of maybe identity issues as people go on in life, you know, the fact of maybe feeling that they're living a lie or, you know, feel like there's some sort of self-deception there, that they truly don't know who they really are, which obviously causes a host of problems. Madison had a question. Go ahead, Madison.
Madison, you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry. This is sort of like a version of the last question, but sort of given the relationship between like the Asian American community and like all the South Asian cultures with mental health and sort of the, I guess, lack of openness about it, I'm sort of wondering how, like what interventions there could be to help get more providers, like people going into this field from these communities to like help bridge that gap a little bit. Like what can we do to sort of increase the pipeline of people from these cultures going into psychology or mental health fields?
Yeah, a lot of the literature just called for like more mental health literacy. But I don't know, like in terms of actually getting like providers into like in this culture, I don't know, Haneen or Maya, if you guys have a better answer to that.
Yeah, I guess this is more just not really in the literature, but more just like my personal experience, like because I'm part of this culture as well. I've just seen like, especially like the younger generations that like Maya and Chloe were talking about earlier, I feel like this generation, given that people are more willing to kind of speak about mental health and kind of emphasize its importance in relation to, you know, life and development, I find that this generation or like the generation right below mine, we're definitely going to see an increase in people going into the field of mental health. A large percentage of people in our culture, like they push a lot for people to go to medical school or be in, you know, professional school. So I think that psychiatry, psychology, mental health, all that stuff is definitely going to increase. And I think if more people pursue professional careers, you know, in this field, we're definitely going to see a lot of representation and more just kind of cultural acceptance, cultural competence within the field for South Asians as well.
And just to add on to that, because I'm also a part of this culture, is like from my personal experience, like growing up and having to keep everything hush hush, because my dad is very traditional Indian. I always felt like something was wrong with me and that everybody else had the best, like these awesome lives with no mental health issues. And then when I learned what it truly was, you know, depression, anxiety, that's what made me want to come into this field. So I feel like a lot of people, especially this younger generation, like Haneen said, are gonna maybe go into it and just kind of, I'm doing it to help people and people like me. So hopefully more people will have that idea, especially, you know, in this generation and going forward.
Great. No, a question I was thinking about for Haneen and Maya, specifically coming from the culture itself, is what do you think are some of the largest barriers in terms of older generations seeing mental health as, sort of a good practice of understanding behavior and thoughts and emotions? And in the sense of helping someone overcome that versus, say, some of the traditions and beliefs, like what is the biggest barriers you've observed in terms of seeing that this stuff is real, right? Or that our field is real, that it actually can help people? What do you think?
I think for me personally, I think the biggest barrier was just the whole like sentiment of even discussing your mental health is seen as a weakness, especially like with my father. He's a very stoic man, especially emotionally. And it's, they take great pride in overcoming life struggles without having to tell anyone about it or without having to, seek help. So I think just because you need to seek help, I don't think that that's a sign of weakness. And I think that's kind of what helps perpetuate the sentiment in our culture that like, if you don't seek help, that's a good thing. Like you're seen as stronger, you can kind of handle things on your own. So I think just that constant cycle of that thought process is one of the biggest barriers to just seeking treatment or to even engage in like discussions about mental health that I've seen personally.
For me, I feel like a lot of it did come from being a woman, I feel like, just because in the Indian culture, the men, like my older brother he had all the freedoms, he could do whatever he wanted, and the men are the providers, whereas the women just have to stay at home and cook and clean. And so I felt like I got a lot of backlash when I first opened up, or I was kind of scared too, because I was like, everyone's providing for me. All I have to do is help my mom around the house and not go anywhere. And I'm fine. So feeling this way was just kind of like unjustified, I think, in my eyes, because I was provided for and everything. And so I felt kind of guilty almost opening up, because I feel like, wow, like they give me what I want. I follow the rules. So why do I still feel this way?
Yeah. Interesting. Do you think that older generations feel that having this sort of modern viewpoint of seeking out help and talking about it and seeking out support and sharing these, thoughts and feelings, that it sort of compromises belief systems or values or practices? And is more so maybe that there's like a strong sense of pride in the values and beliefs themselves that maybe they don't want compromise because of maybe perceived as some sort of new age practice, or that they view psychology as?
I think from what I've seen, and I actually talked to, my friends my age who are also from the similar background. And the thing that we notice the most, especially with the older generation, is the fact that our generation and the younger generations kind of have started to question things that the older generation just so blindly believed before. Really scares them, because they don't understand that like things that they've been thinking of for years is actually wrong or could potentially be super harmful for the following generation. So I think just the fact that like we're starting to ask questions and kind of think for ourselves and not just so blindly follow these like very strong beliefs and traditions, I think is definitely, it's a good change, but I think it also definitely kind of undermines the older generations, and so they kind of refuse to like let those beliefs go.
Gotcha. So therefore, it's saying a value of hierarchy of authority, maybe, right? That basically you don't question authority, whether it be parents, be authority, educators, or whoever, right? The opinions of others. So that maybe you would say, okay, maybe in these collectivistic societies or cultures, as opposed to more Western approaches, that maybe the strength of collectivist society is having a sense, a belief that hierarchy of authority is what leads us to success. Whereas maybe here on the Western Front, we say, well, independent thought and searching for self-identity, self-realization, self-actualization. Maybe we find that now to be the most, sort of powerful means of, existence. So it is interesting. Yes, extremely interesting. I'm glad you guys did this community. I didn't expect many people to kind of focus on this community. Any other questions from classmates? All right, yeah, I don't have any other questions besides that. Excellent job, guys.
I actually
Great job.
had a question, Professor.
Oh, okay, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't.
When you guys were doing your studies, did you see where in the last couple of years there has been an increase where the older as well as the younger are actually gravitating to mental health professionals and seeking help?
That's a good question. There was kind of a mix of studies, some from like 2013 to like 2018, and then there was like a few studies from like 2020 to like 2022. And I don't know necessarily that like any focused on specifically like, I don't even think any of the studies necessarily like looked at like old and new generations, like I don't think so. I don't think so. But I would expect that that would be a direction of future literature, like in the next like 5 to 10 years.
All right. Anything else? Okay. Great. Thank you so much. Great job. We will go into breakout rooms and talk about this week's topics, immigration, acculturation, and all of that. And we'll come back in, let's say we come back in about 10 minutes with our questions, wherever, or anything you want to discuss about the chapter. So I'm going to put everyone into breakout rooms right now. And I'll see you in 10 minutes. All right, welcome back. Kyle, you're showing first up on my screen. So who was in your group and what were some of the discussions you had? Kyle, you're muted.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no problem.
It's RP, Jasmine, and myself. And yeah, we had a pretty deep discussion. We only got through one question, but it was RP's question. So if she wants to go ahead and go over it.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and I'll read it out. It was from the Falakov article. I was actually saying this initially, it seems such a generic, broad question that's not thought-provoking, but then once you get into it, you run off into different topics that it brings up. So it was talking about how individuals who migrate have relationships in different contexts that family therapists must understand. So my question was, what are the effects of migration on the family unit? And I kind of brought it more into like that connection of like when you move your family, let's say to the United States, you're starting off brand new. There could be a language barrier, financial struggle. And I think at like a young age where, your parents are working all the time, you have that thought in your mind where it's like, why are my parents not as active in my life as, let's say, my classmates or those around me, PTA meetings, field trips. So it kind of brings like a sense of resentment maybe. And this is like something I've had other people tell me as well, where at a young age, it felt like there was like abandonment and attachment issues that have carried on to their relationships as they got older as well. So I feel like that's like one aspect of migration that affects the family unit as like a whole. And then Jasmine also brought something up if she wanted to share that.
Yeah. So in understanding like the already stress that comes with migrating to the States, it's like, as clinicians, what can we do to kind of really help support families to really help integrate the culture? And so I was asking questions like, well, about, is it more beneficial for the entire family unit to come together, even though I know that for some families it's not feasible? But I think in discussion, what we came across is that like the most that we can do is just, at least in our areas, know how to connect someone to resources, because one, the resources are scarce, as well as like there may be additional language barriers that the family may be going through. But it's important to really consider what ways we can do to really keep and maintain family units for individuals who are migrating from other countries.
Okay, excellent questions. Well, kind of looking at zooming out for a second, right? As therapists, yes, if there's a language barrier, that's kind of one we can't override. So we probably will have to get some sort of translator or support in terms of translating the information to us, right? But besides that, if we're working with migrant communities, someone who is refugee, asylum seeker, right? Or just an immigrant altogether, our job would be to kind of figure out a few things, right? First, why is the individual or individuals moving, right? Why is there movement? Why is there movement across national boundaries, right? From country to country? What's the reason? Second is to figure out the things that happen before the movement, during the movement, and after the movement, right? Because migrants face some sort of trauma before they even get to the border, right? That's something we need to inquire about and try to find out what happened before coming there, because all sorts of things, very horrible things could have happened before even showing up or even consideration of migrating to another country, right? There could be a lot of traumatic activities that have taken place before. Also, too, just the process of crossing over from border to border is very stressful, very traumatic as well, too, right? Depending on how long that process took, what kind of things they encountered, thinking if just using an easy example, right? We say Central Americans or South Americans may come to the Mexico, US border, right? And maybe their first introduction into what America's about may be Border Patrol agents or people working with customs or, any of the sort. And maybe they face some trauma from those people, right? Maybe they were poorly mistreated just in the process alone, even before they really stepped foot into mainland. They could have experienced some sort of ethnic discrimination, racism, sexism, all sorts of things that we could think of before even getting here, right? So that's one thing. So considering the pre-operational things that happen before even considering coming over, the things that actually happen coming over to another country, right? Or coming over here. And then also the things that happen after, like when we finally have an opportunity to work with a client who is a migrant of some sort, right? Whatever category they fall in, but figuring out what happened in between all that time leading up to here. Because lots can happen, right? Second thing is to figuring out, well, okay, all this stuff has happened. What is the family dynamic? So if family is an issue or a consideration and someone's seeking therapy, well, we have to figure out what is your relationship with your family, right? It could be good or bad, it could be non-existent, right? There could be all sorts of things dealing with, say, guilt, leaving people behind, right? It might be guilt of doing well and still knowing people in their native country are still doing poorly. All sorts of sentiments, right? But RP, for your sort of illustration, were you speaking of, yours sounded interesting because were you referring more to like Mexicans coming over to the US? Or were you talking about a specific group?
I mean, I think just in general, because like I'm Armenian and like a lot of people I talk to, we've all kind of had that same experience. I mean, in terms of like if they grew up in Armenia and moved here, like I was born here and I didn't have the same type of experience as them. But I think it was like I think in terms of like their experiences that I can relate to is there's this expectation to kind of send money back home to your family that you left as well. So like now that there's double the financial stress on the provider, which is typically the males in the house, I
Yeah.
think you're not building that connection as a family unit because there's like this disconnect, especially at a young age, of not understanding why you're not having that like positive communication with like parents. Like I was thinking of it more on that end of, you start blank and you're building up your life, so you're not as present in your child's life majority of the time.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, if you think for younger people, just in general, society, the social forces and the pressures exuded by society are stronger than it would for older people, right? Older people are more already established and ingrained in the way that they think and their behavior, right? So a younger person is more influenced by their society. So if they were here interacting with other, let's say, quote unquote, Americans, and their family back home is expecting them to just be a resource to make money and send back to help out, their exposure here will lend them to kind of think like, hey, the opportunities, there's a vast amount of opportunities. Maybe other people should try to come here too, right? Maybe other parts of the family should try to come here and help out because it doesn't seem sensible. So there's all sorts of things that could happen there too. There could be some sort of anger issues or dissent, like you say, right? They get further disassociated from their families by not feeling, I guess, appreciated in some sense. So yeah, absolutely. But I think there's the key thing is like, especially when it's younger, very younger people, they're more of a source of information about the new environment because they're probably more exposed to all of the changes happening in that environment, right? They're probably a little bit more aware and a little bit more reactive. It's a little bit more intense, I would say, the emotions. Okay, great discussion there. All right, so Haneen, who was in your group?
It was me and Chloe.
Okay. And what did you discuss?
Yeah, Chloe, I don't know if you wanted to ask your question first, since that's kind of what we started with, but we were basically just talking about kind of like the experiences and how it was different from what we thought. So from one of the articles that Chloe read, and then just from an article that I read actually for another class, it brought up this idea that the mental health outcomes and experience of immigrants versus people who were born and raised in America. This was specifically for Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. But it said that the mental health status and mental health outcomes for the immigrants were actually better and more positive than for those who were born and raised in America. And so we thought like it would kind of be the opposite. So we were just kind of discussing like what possible explanations or reasons for that difference could have been. And then we were also talking about just how technology has like helped us keep in touch with like our culture. Because like Chloe was saying how she lives like across the country from her family, but just having things like FaceTime and messaging and all of that still makes her feel, close. And like for me personally, like I'm able to keep in touch with my family who still lives in India. If I didn't have, messaging apps like WhatsApp or FaceTime or things like that, I probably wouldn't have been as in touch or close to my culture since I was born here. So we were just kind of talking about implications for that. And I don't know if you wanted to add anything else, Chloe.
Yeah, I think like that kind of covers it. And then also just like this kind of like okay. Like what Haneen was talking about at the beginning, where it's like the experience of immigrants is sometimes like better than you might assume. Like there's actually like pretty positive mental health around immigration in a lot of cases. And then kind of like comparing this with the idea of like xenophobia, and like especially if there is like some type of, I don't know, like current event or like things that happen in history that make certain cultures, or not cultures, like nationalities, more discriminated against. For example, like the rise of Asian hate crimes after the COVID-19 pandemic, or other things like that. We can think of a million, but I just was kind of like comparing that kind of idea in my head too. It's a lot of words, sorry.
Yeah. No, excellent. I mean, I think, so in the chapter, it kind of talked about Berry's acculturation model, right? How certain immigrants either assimilate more or become resistant to the new culture, or kind of have a little bit of mixture of both, holding on to a lot of aspects of their old culture and trying to slowly adapt and take on traits of the new culture. But if you think about it, going to another place that requires some sort of innate motivation. You have to have some sort of motivation for something to be able to move across borders, right? So inherently there is already a motivation for several things. Maybe it's just economic resources, but most likely there's an appreciation maybe for some sort of freedom or liberalism, I would say, here in the US, maybe if it's real or perceived, right? And so if one was to even consider seeking out some sort of help, there has to be already present some sort of motivation there to say, I am open to seeking the help to begin with. So we say that person has probably as a high acculturation, right? They have a high adaptation, that they are essentially open to immersing in that culture, in the way that that culture thinks, in the way that that culture practices certain things. While others, we would say maybe they're still skeptical. So maybe they have a mixture, right? They're still facing skepticism. So thus they're still retaining on to their beliefs and values, which will make them kind of fearful of seeking the help in general. But there has, I would say, think of maybe the motivation there. There has to be some sort of motivating factor for someone to seek the help, and the degree of that motivation, I would say, is whether they would be totally accepting of the help, right? And they're probably, even if the help, the assistance we give as psychologists or therapists, even if the help would be sort of like a placebo in some sense, that there's probably some sort of motivation that just engaging in the practice of help will ultimately have them in a better position than when they approached us, right? So we think of maybe there's some underlying motivation factors, I would say, that cause one group of people or certain individuals to have better outcomes than us. The other part is we don't, as Americans, if we're born here, we don't have to acculturate. There's nothing to adapt to, there's nothing to assimilate to, because this is a Western model of looking at the human brain, thoughts, emotions, minds. So it's not anything really novel to us with our culture. So if it's not novel, then it's normalized. If it's normalized, we're probably a little desensitized to a lot of it, right? Until it trends back and becomes something like it is now. It's starting to trend back and become very popular amongst people. Mental health is something to pay attention to. But I would say just the motivation of novelty may be a factor of saying, hey, these are better outcomes, even if they are real or maybe say placeboed in some sense, right? It's that motivation for new, I think that is a huge factor that's overlooked sometimes. Okay, so that's Haneen and Chloe. Next up, Charles. Who was in your group?
So I had Megan and Madison.
Okay.
Um, so we discussed my question. So I highlighted the expressions of so I got this from the article Silva, Paris, and Ennis, 2017. Expressions such as "si si puede" and "la lucha," like all those expressions convey messages of strength, courage, perseverance in the midst of challenging circumstances. So my question was, does having perseverance also mean having too much pride to ask for help? How do we differentiate the pride and perseverance that clients have, and relating it to the stigma of having mental illness?
All right, so pride and perseverance. And with that, did anybody come up with any conclusions in the group or any sort of assumptions or anything?
So Megan mentioned that maybe we can, like in the session, we might be able to see how the client is talking and what they're saying. Maybe you can break it apart and see, even though they're saying, yes, I can do it, there's still some experiences or situations that they say that they do need help.
Okay.
Yeah, I was just kind of talking about that kind of I'm so strong, I've been through all this, but I'm stronger because of it. Like that might also be a defense mechanism. But then also that it would be even harder to crack if it's then sort of reinforced by your culture. Sort of like the example of like, oh, this messed up thing happened to me, but it's all good. I'm strong now, you know, and instead of actually talking about the thing in the first place or addressing the trauma. And yeah, and so we talked about how that would be even more difficult with the context of culture and that being a value.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that one is, that's pretty difficult to try to assess if that's something that the client is using as a coping strategy and kind of how it's maybe even related to other coping strategies back in their native culture. Yeah, so let me think about that one, because that one's pretty difficult, like to try to crack a code on that. But anybody else can contribute in thinking about something they read within the literature that can help that? Yeah, I have to think about that one because that one has a lot of layers to it, right? Because maybe the client views that as some sort of success in that mind frame, and that if, you know, potentially if viewed as having some sort of failures in the previous country, coming here, maybe having a mindset of success means that, hey, I've conquered, you know, I've conquered my mental issue, I've conquered you know, something that I'm going through, and maybe just pawning off as some sort of resilience or overcoming. But you also mentioned too, Charles, about pride, right? So we say there's a lot of cultural pride, that might be another barrier, obstacle to overcome as a therapist. Because that's such a huge part of self-identity. And so I have to say, really maybe trying to figure out how ingrained they are in terms of like their origins, in terms of their self-identity, like how much of a factor does that play in how they identify themselves in the present moment, right?
Professor, would that be an example of the case study that we had?
Which one? The one with Nadia?
Yes.
In what way?
At the beginning, when she when they moved, when they got married and they moved, and she was
Mhm.
like, she was having a hard time with it and she felt alone, even though she had in-laws there. But it was hard for her to cope with her feeling and she felt isolated. However, she wanted her kids to grow up and learn, you know, the responsibility, financial responsibilities of here. Would that be
Yeah,
something along that line?
yeah, I mean, you have to figure, like, you know, you have a client and they don't have the financial resources. So even for Nadia, I remember she said her husband was educated, and I think he had a degree back in Pakistan or something of the sort. And that coming here to degree, you know, was kind of, I guess, you know, worthless or useless. And so there would be financial struggles, and therefore, what does a person have to hold on to? What they have to hold on to maybe is a sense of pride about their identity, their origins, their culture, right? And they're probably still having some sort of battle or war inside their mind of trying to accept this new culture as a means to gaining success, financial success, right? Which means you kind of have to work within the system if you're trying to obtain financial success, right? You're going to have to set aside some things, or at least try to navigate some of your ideologies or values when it comes to making money in this country. Yeah, so sometimes it's just, I would say something that a person only has, something they only have at that point may be their personal self-identity, and maybe some of the practices and values, beliefs they have from their native country, which, you know, until their situations change, you know, that those may also change over time as well too. And they do. I see them quite often. People become more accepting of American culture kind of with the more money they make. I see that there's a high correlation of being financially successful in a career and a job and a position here relative to acculturating to American culture and kind of subsiding a lot of the old country's practices and beliefs and things. All right, who we have last? Kashe, did we talk about your group or no?
We didn't.
Who's your group?
It was myself and Maya.
Okay.
And we spent most of our time talking about acculturation. And we was trying to figure out the separation aspect of it, maintaining the own culture while rejecting the new culture. And we was trying to figure out, you know, if a person leave and go somewhere else, how is it possible for them to actually just live their own culture and ways and not deal with the place that they come to? And we brought up the Mormons and stuff like that, but we were still trying to figure out if we was reading too much into it or what. But I mean, I don't understand how I could leave the US and go to Africa and not do anything that Africa does.
Okay. So you're just kind of assessing the degree kind of to which people acculturate, like either they're rejecting new culture or the accepting of it?
Yes.
Okay.
Like
Yeah.
I don't know if I don't get it. I mean, like I can't leave my house and come stay with you and not do stuff that you do in your house.
Well, think of, if you value what I do, if you identify that what I do has some sort of merit or value to you, maybe you participate, right? And then also maybe it's a thing of, remember we said background counts, right? So if one is motivated to seek out something new, then there's a reason why they're seeking it out, and they probably be a little bit more accepting. So we need to know, was somebody forced out to go seek another country, right? So what's their pressure to be forced to leave? Was there pressure to just don't have so much pressure to leave and just be open to try something new? Yeah, there's a lot of reasons why. I say the background. So we looked at maybe refugees versus asylum seekers versus just immigrants, right? Who here knows the difference? Who could tell me what the difference is?
Refugees are the people who leave to seek something better, and asylums are the ones who are, so to say, like running away, pushed out.
Yeah, right. So you say asylum seekers is maybe for some political or religious reason they're pushed out, but most likely political, right? There's something that they're being targeted for some reason. Refugees mean people currently outside the US trying to get in, and there's a process, whereas immigration mean people who have already established some sort of residency, whether it's legal or illegal. So I think a lot of that context matters in figuring out where people, what are the motivations to be a migrant? What are the motivations to be crossing into the border? Right? Do you already have some sort of residency established, or are you just going to be lost in a shuffle, being some sort of refugee, right? Or being in some sort of encampment or something, have restriction of movement, things of that nature. So all that plays a factor. But
So-
definitely, it still has to do, acculturation or adapting to a culture has to do whether one sees value in the new culture and their experiences from the new culture, right? If you experience some sort of discrimination, if for whatever reason, obviously you'll probably have less value to the culture, which could lead to a lot of issues psychologically. But you were about to say something. I think I cut you off.
So if we are working with a client that's been, that's done come over here, is it wise in doing intake or whatever to figure out, if their assimilation or marginalization or separation or integration, is it wise to kind of figure out where they fit it, with the acculturation? I mean, like, because that would be a key point in knowing how to, help them through therapy. Like, I mean, but that would be rude to be like, well, do you do what we do?
Yeah, I mean, depending on, the world is a big place. So depending on where they come from, you could say, well, hey, there's a degree of commonality between X country and X culture and America. Right, so you figure out how big of a degree of separation between the cultures there is first, because some cultures, you could say European cultures are probably people won't have such an issue, right? You could say a lot of our culture is very similar, right? So their adaptation to American culture is probably not that difficult, outside of maybe some verbiage or some language barriers. But you say like, hey, the political systems may be very similar, right? The economic systems are not too far apart. They may have a lot of American tourists in their country, so they may have a lot of American interaction. But if it's another country where it's seen as very dissimilar to Western culture, yes, you have a high degree of, I would say, resistance, and even being transparent and being communicative, being open to receiving treatment, or open to sharing a discussion about it. So there's some very stark different cultures out there. I say it pose you a lot of different challenges, but let's say your first assessment is figuring out how different is that culture than us, and in what ways is that culture different than here, right?
Okay, and then Maya, she had added something to it that was interesting.
Go ahead, Maya.
I had just asked about, let me see which article it was. It was basically just talking about how the US Census kind of groups Spanish speaking individuals together. And I was just asking, well, if it's, an obvious wrong and been pointed out as inaccurate, why hasn't it been changed? But I think Cache kind of cleared that up for me. She was kind of telling me about her most recent census that she filled out, how they had changed it. And there are like even subsections where you can fill in your native language or, the other.
Okay.
So
I think language is a critical component to, I would say, adaptation or acculturation, because language is how we communicate, right? And so there's probably a host of motivations for the US Census Bureau to want to classify an entire group of people into, say, maybe a language category. One is to identify that there are probably a lot of people out there that are resistant to speaking English, right? Older communities, I would say, Spanish-speaking communities, especially, I would say, my experience here in Chicago, there's a lot of older Spanish-speaking grandmothers, grandfathers, older generations, and they don't care to speak the English, right? Because learning a new language is difficult as you age. You master language by age 7, which means if you try to learn a new language past age 7, you have to really put effort, a lot of effort to it. And mastering it, then it needs to be managed, which means you have to constantly utilize it. So, because if you don't use it, you lose it. So imagine someone else coming later on in life over to the US, they would experience a very high degree of difficulty trying to master whatever we would describe as the Queen's English or something over here. So I would say language is extremely important. And it's probably to monitor how large the degree of shift in this company is for Spanish-speaking and Latin communities. So we could see the impact of kind of where we're going in the future, right? So they're probably trying to assess some sort of trends on what our world will look like, well, what America will look like in the next 10 to 15, 20 years, if they see an increase in Spanish-speaking individuals over time, and how that's going to impact a lot of things, whether it's government programs, government departments, corporations, and marketing, products, services, all those type of stuff. But I say there's probably multi-dimensional or multi-factors about why they need that information, but language is extremely important. I think they talked about this chapter, how that's a very critical component to acculturation, because we can't communicate as, someone speaks a language and you don't speak their language, there's no starting point, right? All right, any other questions before we kind of go through the lecture? I think this was a pretty interesting chapter because once again, I think the chapters kind of increase in complexity as we go on, right? This one is complex. So many different types of people out there and so many world views on, I say psychology or and how it impacts people's, viewpoints of the mind, the body, the soul, if this stuff is real about helping people versus just some sort of their own personal spiritual enlightenment and things like that, or whatever belief systems you come from. All right, let's wrap up the lecture and then we'll get out of here. So let me share my screen for a second. Hang on. Give me 1 second, everyone. All right, I'm gonna share my screen right now. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
All right. All right, immigration and acculturation. All right, so what's immigration? Immigration is just the introduction or arrival of new people into a habitat or population, right? So just to keep it simple, it's just movement of people into a different habitat other than their native habitat. This, I would say, facet of psychology is difficult to research the experience of migrants as a whole group due to their intrinsic differences, so many different cultures, right? So many different family support systems. And it's difficult to try to establish and understand their economic well-being because of these differences. Some immigrant pathways, socioeconomic factors for immigrants, factors relating to fear of persecution based on political, ethnic, and religious affiliations, which we described as asylum seekers or refugees. Family reunification, maybe they're trying to reunite with family in one location. Sometimes things are involuntary, right? They didn't have a choice. You can see that maybe with children, immigrants, and then transnational, some people who are just sojourners and just kind of move from country to country. Refugees versus asylees, right? Refugee status is sought when a person is outside the US. There's a process for that. And so they need to be vetted and approved beforehand, right? They need to be vetted and approved beforehand from American authorities before they are allowed to come over, right? Whereas asylum is sought by those already within the US. So they're already over here, they've crossed the border. Now they're seeking asylum so they don't have to be sent back to whatever persecution that they're facing in their native land. Right, and so they also need to apply within 1 year of arriving. That would be with the asylum seekers. You have to apply for some sort of asylum, right? Refugees, unlike immigrants in general, are leaving their home country because they face persecution and are often escaping wars or political turmoil. Examples, when I was in Africa, there were a lot of different conflicts going on, and whoever was the losing side of the conflict, typically after the conflict was over, they were either rounded up and executed, right? Or put in some servitude, or just harmed economically, not able to work, or face some sort of political or social persecution. Some risk factors, right? Language barriers, pretty obvious, right? Some differences in educational backgrounds. Even when we talked about Nadia and her husband, hey, if you had a PhD or doctorate in another country, it probably doesn't correspond here. Therefore, you're going to have to start from scratch, right? So some changes in status or socioeconomic status. Maybe you were wealthy in your previous country, but you're facing the persecution, and now you're no longer wealthy. Maybe you've gained access to those resources, and now you have to start from scratch in your new country all over again. Separation from family and friends, that's high risk for depression and other issues. Lack of financial and social support, right? If you don't have proper papers or proper support, you could find yourself in a more dire situation, maybe trying to come here, facing sort of homelessness or have to engage in some sort of activities to survive. That'll be detrimental. Access to health care is one. You know, what if you get sick or you face some sort of injury? How are you able to gather health care when you maybe are not properly have papers or whatever to get the health care? Struggles navigating social systems such as schools, right? Sort of interacting with other people in school systems coming from such a different background, and facing xenophobia and discrimination altogether. Some protective factors. So we talked about high resilience, right? And better physical health and behavioral health. In the search for protective factors in country of origin, family network, and collective coping strategies. Right? So we say that maybe sometimes having a sense of pride is a coping strategy from country of origin, therefore it's a protective factor. Acculturation. All right, this refers to changes that take place as a result of contact with culturally dissimilar people, groups, and social influences. All right, so you think of all the changes that can happen during the acculturation process. Maybe you start to begin to speak differently, maybe you dress differently, maybe you are exposed to new ideologies you had not considered before, right? Maybe you engage in romantic relationships with people who are from totally different cultures, right? But you have all types of changes that happen, and also trying to navigate how to survive economically, support yourself, seek out proper education and tools for that. So there's a lot that goes into acculturation. Acculturation was originally conceptualized as a one-dimensional process, right, in which retention of a heritage, culture, and acquisition of the receiving culture were cast as opposing ends of a single continuum. All right, and here's Berry's acculturation model. So we say we have high and low on the y-axis, low and high on the x-axis here, and then we have maintenance of own culture, right? So we say maintenance would be maintaining own culture while rejecting the new culture. Low, and then integration would be sort of maintaining, it's kind of right there, beginning features of own culture while adding parts to new culture. Whereas low would be marginalization, rejecting both new and your own culture. And high assimilation, high will be assimilation, full adaptation to new culture without retention of own culture. So totally immersing yourself in the new culture, rejecting your old culture, and just starting all new would be high. Multi-dimensional acculturation model by Schwartz and others. Here we have some practices, values, and identifications. So we say some practices would be your heritage language, your heritage culture, some foods, and then you have the receiving society language, receiving of the culture and the foods in the receiving society. Your heritage culture would have collectivism, independence, right? Dependent on one another, from familism, right? Just having these family values and support systems. Whereas your receiving culture would have individualistic perspectives and some independence factors, right? Just kind of doing it all on your own and trying to find some sort of self-identity or a place in society. And then your heritage is your country of origin, whereas receiving is your receiving country. So as a summary, acculturation is not a one-size-fits-all concept. Right? Rootman contended that the similarity between the receiving culture and the migrant's heritage culture can help to determine how much acculturation is needed to adapt to the receiving culture. Or maybe there is a degree in which a degree of changes one has to accept in order to have some sort of success with the receiving culture. An additional factor that we talked about earlier was language, and that must be considered because that is such a huge impact to the acculturation process, whether one is able to pick up the new language in the receiving culture, or at least pick up parts of the language in order to survive. When studying acculturation, the types of migrants under consideration must be considered. So we need to know, are people coming over here by force? Are they asylum seekers? Are they coming over here voluntarily, involuntarily, maybe just for financial reasons? What kind of maybe traumas they face in that process of migration. And the cultural and or ethnic background of newcomers is another important determinant of how the acculturation process will unfold. So we talked about how some cultures are more similar to the US in a lot of ways, politically, economically, and maybe some of the values and practices and ideologies, whereas others may be on the complete opposite of the spectrum in terms of some of those factors. Next, we got journeys of migration, right? Some opportunity and continuity. Right, so the migration narrative is the phenomenology of migration, right? It's a very interesting phenomenon, how people migrate and move over from border to border and try to adapt and assimilate, right? And the migration narrative is time here, who first, the left behind, came later, and a reunion. So you think of all this plays a significant role, in which case, who was here first within the family group or group, right? How much time did they spend here? That's another factor. That's part of that narrative. Who was left behind? What did that do? Does that cause any sort of trauma or feelings or guilt? And also what it would be like to be reunited, right? What are the impacts of mental impacts of having a reunion? Some tools to explore motivations, responsibility, hopes, regrets, events, attachments, and receptions. We talked about that in our discussions about some people have a lot of responsibility here in order to send money back home. Some people just have some motivations to be part of the new culture, right? We need to explore that. There could be a lot of depression because of some regrets, maybe during the migration process. What are some of the events that happen? What is the degree of attachments from people back home? And how are we received in the new country? Pre-migration and entry experience, right? Coax migration. Are people kind of forced, right? Some children are forced over, elderly could be forced, women could be pushed over. Those can have implications psychologically, and some ambivalent and unprepared migrations, meaning that they're just highly confused. It's a very confused process. Maybe people don't speak the language and they're trying to understand how all the rules work. Maybe they're held at maybe say even the border for a very long time, and they experience sort of all sorts of trauma in that process. And they were highly unprepared. Maybe they don't know anybody here in the new country. and they don't have anywhere to go and trying to figure out how to survive. And then listening to the details of each migration is important. So figuring out everything that happened in all of these events, we should take those into consideration when doing therapy with these individuals. Some post-traumatic stress can be due to pre or post-migration experiences, as well as traumas during the migration. So we talked about that. Uprooting of meaning, right? So root metaphor, original native soil, they bring with them some physical stuff. The landscape they grew up in is gone, right? Some social items, social marginality and social isolation relates to lower self-esteem and depression. So if people don't lose their social network, right? Now they feel marginalized and isolated, and obviously that could cause a host of problems mentally. And then culture shocks. We saw some two factors, anxiety and mourning, right? So you experience anxiety because all of this new environment and the people involved in it and the things of trying to survive, and then mourning of your native country, your native culture, and just how that all takes place, that change. That goes systemic. A therapist must be aware of the family's dynamic membership in varied groups, meaning that we need to know what sort of social status they were in back home, levels of education, you know, what was their membership within their group, and how do they feel about their membership in the new country, right? So here in America, how would they feel that they fit in or have some sort of membership here in the United States as they transition? Looking at employment, education, and extended family as well too. Some psychological consequences, right? Anxiety-related symptoms, bioendocrine stress, acute psychoses, panic attacks, dissociative conditions, agoraphobia, alcohol, drug problems, right? All these things that can happen as a result of transitioning across borders. Somatization, palpitations, dizziness, nervousness, and insomnia. So individuals can feel all of these symptoms as a result of the movement, right? In which case, here what we say is it's easier to complain of a health problem than emotional pain to a stranger. So some individuals who are migrants may not seek out to get emotional help, emotional support, or mental help. Rather, they would go seek some sort of physiological help, right? Based on the somatic symptoms, right? Like you're saying here, palpitations and dizziness, nervousness, insomnia. Maybe they'll go get prescriptions for medication for things, and really the issue has to deal with more of a mental aspect than a pure physiological one, right? And so they may pawn off some of their, I would say, somatized like factors that they're having due to the mental issues they're having.
I have a question on that.
Yes.
If they're complaining of physical symptoms instead of emotional symptoms, if they do see like a doctor or whatever, do the doctors treat the physical symptoms, or do they are doctors telling them that they think it's more of a psychological issue?
I mean, yeah, doctors typically are trained, dealing with particular symptoms to refer one to maybe seek some mental health, specifically if they can't find a biological reason for the symptoms, right? So if they can't find one that they can prescribe a medication for, or doing their own testing that they can't find a reason for those symptoms, and obviously they'll probably refer those individuals to seek some sort of mental health therapy. And so, yeah, most doctors are trained in that. If If they can't find anything based on labs or testing or whatever the case may be, they're, they'll refer them over to speak with someone, talk with someone. All right, some players in the migration drama, those who leave their homes, right? A sense of guilt they may have for leaving their homes, relatives left behind, children, parents. You can imagine the type of trauma you would have being in a foreign country other than your children, or being in a foreign country and maybe you have older parents or sickly parents, and now you feel that maybe some sense of abandonment. Relatives waiting in the new country, right? They're one of the players in this drama. Maybe hopes that they're gonna give them a great experience in the new country, or hopefully they're not gonna provide an even worse experience, right? People of the host country, how they are received by the country, right? So how we say Americans would treat migrants or immigrants or refugees or asylum seekers based on the media, maybe political banter, depending on where you are going to be located in the country. What part of the country? Are you in the Northeast? Are you in the Midwest? Are you in the South? Are you in the West? You get a whole change in viewpoints, world views of how people treat these specific group of individuals, right? They may be more receptive in metropolitan areas, right? Urbanized areas. Maybe they may feel a little bit more ostracized or stigmatized in more rural areas. So it may depend on geographically where they're located as well too. I think lastly, we have children of immigration, right? Refugee experience. Fundamental difference is motivation, right? Children are motivated because things are still novel and new, right? They're still figuring things out, figuring out life, probably have a little bit more curiosity to their environment than older populations. But sometimes there's a wish to return home when things calm down, right? You may feel some sense of isolation and want to have some familiarity with your family back home. And there also could be experiences of PTSD. Some sort of just trauma from the changes to your to the new country. All right, for many, success is redefined. Success is not assimilating and growing deep roots in the new land. Rather, success is returning home after achieving goals that motivated the migration in the first place and earning the resources, financial and social, that would enable them to have a better life back home. So for some, coming here may be a financial motivation, in which case to achieve more financial success and have that success transfer back over to your native country and maybe provide a better life and standard for your family, in which case there's a redefinition of what success is. Maybe it's not staying here permanently. Maybe it's just achieving a goal and going back home. Psychosocial impacts. Separation of families. Separations may not be harmful if they are considered normal in the child's native culture, and if the child has healthy relationship with the parents and family members who are providing cares. All right, so in some cultures, children have a lot of independence, right? It may be normal for them to have some sort of separation from time to time. The cultural frame for separation will influence how the child internalizes and responds to the experience, right? So what is the framework of their culture? What are some of the factors in that culture that may influence the separation anxiety, right? It may be high, it may be low, depending on where they come from. Regular communication with parents is important. So if there's ability to have, I would say, stable communications with the parents, that would be extremely important to deal with degrees of separation or anxieties from it. And timetable to reunification is helpful. You know, one knows in their mind when they're able to return. That's very helpful instead of having sort of an ambiguous sense of returning, you know, a timetable, I would say. Reunification can cause ambivalence if attached to the caregiver, right? Like you said, just could cause some sort of confusion. To be reunited, if one was attached to, say, a family here, and they've gotten very close to the family, if they're a migrant or an individual that's a bond, and now going back home could be very confusing, right? And there'd be a whole range of emotions about going back and leaving person here. It may be considered to having two families at that point. Some children may be meeting their parents for the first time here. And that could be extremely confusing and traumatic and emotional. If new siblings are born, might be resentment. If you haven't had time with those new siblings and had a lot of experience with them, you know, being reunited may cause a lot of resentment or envy. Parental authority is renegotiated. So if you've already experienced some sort of independence and made money on your own, and maybe you've received a lot of new information or ideology or philosophy about life, you may renegotiate the authority once you've been reunited with your family. And gains of immigration can be tainted by loss. So some of the things you may have gained through your migration process could be harmed due to some sort of significant loss, whether it be economic or personal.
Will we look at this like we
Cultural
look at
focus.
adjustment disorder?
What's that?
Will we look at that like we look at adjustment disorder?
Yeah, I say they have some sort of similarity. Yeah, there's some components to adjustment disorder to that. Cultural brokers. Children come in contact with American culture sooner and are more intensely than parents, right? Because they go to school and they see a host range of individuals that they communicate with who are different than them every day. And so a lot of social force, social pressure is exuded on children, so they adapt quicker, right? Children can have intense reactions because of these interactions. Unless concerted effort is made, the vocabulary and literacy level of the language of origins become difficult. Children teach their parents about how things are done here, right? So since children have this intense exposure, more so than their parents, they're normally the ones that are looked at as the information centers, right? About how things are going, trends, viewpoints, how things should be done within the new culture. Language brokers, average age begins at 10 years old. Translate versus interpreting the language. Children could balance checkbooks, negotiated social services agencies, right? Schools and sometimes at the doctor's office. Right? So children could be the gateway to this interpretation and translation for a lot of these immigrant families. Privy to family secrets. For former family leaders may be demoted depending on the nature in which they maybe provide economic resources or interact with society. Adaptation and resilience, how children are received new context plays a critical role in their adaptation, right? And some important issues is, were they discriminated against? Are they documented or are they undocumented? There could be some sort of harsh perspective there. The qualities of the schools in which they attend, and also the safety in the neighborhood, right? In which case are they stigmatized or ostracized just in their immediate environment in which they live. All right, and that's it for our lecture. Any questions before we go? No questions. All right, great. Looking forward to the next presentations, and I will see everyone next Tuesday. So if nothing else, have a great weekend. See ya.
Sorry, I was on mute.
Oh.
Sorry, I just was gonna stay for a second because I had emailed you like a few weeks ago, but I actually have to miss next class. So I just wanted to like remind you that I won't be there. And obviously we'll like try to get caught up and make sure I'm still like doing the async work and everything. But just wanted to see if there was like anything else that like you needed from me or anything.
No, you're good. Yeah, you
Okay.
presented this week, so you're pretty much caught up on it. So
Okay, awesome.
You'll be back the following week, right?
Yeah. I just I have to be at like a thing for work and I like can't get out of it. So it's kind of like one of those situations where it's like I have to be two places at once. And I don't like, I don't know. I kind of am like a little hands tied with having to go to this thing for work.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Prioritize what you need to get done.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
I'll
I
see
will
you.
see you the week after. Okay.
All right, cool.
Bye.
Sounds good. Take care.
Thank you.
I'll see you
You too.
later.